same thing's going to happen with law schools, I think. Here's what I think Stanford ought to do. Okay, I'm going to play the legal academic game of like having a sort of
everybody ready?
Grandiosity.
Writing
sort
this
of
down.
A narcissistic grandiosity. All right, I'm both president of Stanford Law School and dean of the law school at the same time. This is what I do. I cut Stanford's tuition by 30% right now, just like this. I just do it. $7 million. It's a lot of money, but on the other hand, the endowment of this university is $17 billion. The endowment of the law school, secret, but little bird has told me it might be in the neighborhood of around $700 million, which means around $35 million a year in income just from the endowment. So $7 million cut, you could probably figure out a way to do it. Now, what you can't do, because it's illegal, is to call up Bob Post and Martha Minow and say, you guys cut your tuition 30% too. Right? You can't do that, because that would be conspiring. You can only conspire in the direction of raising tuition rather than lowering it. Right? But you don't need to do that. Just do it. Right? You could do it, and it would make it. Stanford would be the #1 ranked law school in the country within 5 years. It just would be. And also, the person who did it, you know, their name would ring out, basically, in the history of American, not just legal education, but education in general. What do you do in regard to U.S. News? Which, by the way, as Deborah mentioned, you actually get positive credit in U.S. News the more inefficiently you educate your students. Because the more money you spend, that's considered a proxy for quality. Imagine if you measured cars that way. It's like, oh, this car must be better because it costs twice as much, right? There's a concept in economics called a Veblen good, which functions that way, right? That people just use cost as a proxy for quality, so it has an inverted demand curve essentially. Well, education kind of works that way. Well, this is what you do with U.S. News. You just say, we're not giving you any data. Sorry, you're a defunct magazine. Literally, you don't exist anymore. The only thing you have is a bunch of dweeby prospective law students going out and buying your stupid rankings. Do you think medical schools care about the rankings in the U.S.? I don't think anything evidence that they do. You just tell them, forget it. We're not playing your game anymore. We're Stanford. We don't have to play anymore. We have a tree for a mascot, and we're not going to play the game with U.S. News anymore. And we're going to cut our tuition 30%, and we're reforming this thing right now. We've got the money, we've got the status, and we're going to do it. So that's what I would do. I'm obviously not in that position, but it's an idea, right?
Well, let me just say a word about U.S. News, and then throw it open to Frank to deal with the tuition suggestion. But you know, I don't think it's as easy to get U.S. News and World Report to change its ways. When I was president of the Association of American Law Schools, there was a huge push in a lot of schools threatening to withhold data. And I sat down with the editor of the law school division of the U.S. News to talk about ways that, quote, we might work together. You know, basically they'll get proxies for that data. A lot of the data is already available through NALP, and you know, schools that have tried to avoid the U.S. News and World Reports, undergraduate institutions, haven't been successful really in getting much structural change there. And I think they just come up with some more imperfect proxies because a lot of the data is publicly available. And getting them to try to evaluate different things and change the way they rate them. I felt at the end of that conversation it was sort of like talking to Sports Illustrated about getting them to, you know, clean up the swimsuit edition, you know. Well, maybe if we didn't put high heels on the model, or, you know, the bathing suits weren't quite as bad, would that be okay with you guys? You know, no, the answer is the fundamental problem with the ranking structure is coming up with a single bottom line version based on hugely fuzzy and imperfect proxies for quality. And I don't see them changing. What I do think is possible is to come up with an alternative ranking structure, and this is what saved medical schools. It's not like there aren't ranking structures out there, but there's not a lockstep on them by one, as Paul put it, you know, magazine of really questionable credentials to be doing this kind of survey. So I think if everybody got behind an alternative model that gave out information without the kind of single bottom line score, we'd all be a lot better off. Frank, say a word about
I didn't want to jump in about the nuts and bolts of finance in the law school, because you're having a much bigger conversation than that. I want to bring it down to that level. But definitely would love, to hear suggestions to how to solve this. The reason I'm pretty confident in cutting tuition, 30% wouldn't do it, is one, of course, is as Professor Campos said, we would drop in the rankings because we'd be more efficient somehow, right? The more you spend, the better it is for you in the rankings. So that's kind of silly. But more importantly, I think we do try to be a leader on this front. There's no question we have the lowest average debt of any elite law school for our graduating class. We have the highest scholarship average of any elite law school. We have the highest average LRAP. And yet nobody follows us, right? Instead, I watch the elite schools like Chicago, New York, basically abandon their LRAP programs and go to the federal government program, which is good, but not as good as all of the programs that were there before. Yale just cut their loan forgiveness program significantly. So I think we're doing these things. When the endowment dropped a few years ago for all the schools, we kept our financial aid up, even though it meant using reserves and depleting endowment more, and nobody followed us, right? And we're sitting up there with our average scholarships and LRAP and everything that's going up, and everyone else is going down. So I wish they were following. They don't follow, so I don't know quite how to address.
Well, and another, since you brought up the scholarships, really regressive part of the current structure is that the vast majority of institutions now have gone to merit-based scholarships, which means that needy students are subsidizing, oftentimes more affluent students, because they tend to be much more likely to be the ones who get the merit scholarships. And then in order to maintain your merit scholarship, you have to be in the top half of your class, which is statistically impossible for a lot of the people who get the merit scholarship, so it puts a huge extra layer of stress on. So, there's a real problem there. Stanford is one of the few places that, has resisted going this route.
Yeah, I just want to mention one thing about that that's really shocking when you look at the debt stats. The debt stats are horrible for law students, but if you look at the elites, there's a class stratification angle here, which is really shocking. 23% of Columbia's law graduates, cost of attendance $230,000, graduate with no law school debt. 21% at NYU, no law school debt. 27% at Yale, no law school debt. And it's not because they're giving out a ton of merit money. It's because a lot of rich kids go there. And I think basically what ends up happening is people end up in these economic bubbles where they just don't recognize that $200,000 a year is not a middle class income. And I think that's a big problem that we have in America in general right now. In institutions that go way beyond law schools, but law schools, we have our own fight to fight in regard to this. Yeah.
This student to be in I think I can answer that because I'm not.
Really appreciate you saying that, because one of the things that keeps this whole thing going is silence. Right? You went to an elite law school, you're unemployed, you're in a terrible situation, but you are socialized to internalize that stigma and not talk about it. Right? Instead, you come here and you tell these people, this is my situation. And that situation is a situation which is extremely commonplace among people who graduate, not just from any old law school, but from elite law schools. One of the people who I've worked most closely with in regard to this whole thing is someone who graduated from NYU, middle of the class, 2008, worked for a big New York law firm for 2 years, got laid off during the downturn, which may end up being actually a structural rather than a cyclical change, has $170,000 in debt, is living in his parents' basement in Alabama, and can't get a job as a lawyer of any kind. Because once you're out there, there are tons of people who have experience. They know how to litigate cases from beginning to end. They know how to do all kinds of things that you don't know how to do. And that's who you end up competing with. And now, I don't want to talk too much about that because, after all, that's you mostly are still above the waterline here, but that's creeping up. And I think, I don't want to be too frivolous about this, but I do think that one possibility for real change here is there's going to be too many people living in their parents' basements, and those baby boomers are going to start getting annoyed at the notion that our kids are coming back to us because we now function in an economy where they have an enormous debt that they can't pay with the jobs that they can get. And so, I really thank you for saying that, because there are a lot of people in this gentleman's situation, And there's probably even some people who graduated from Stanford in that situation. Not nearly as many as from some other elite and sub-elite schools. But this is a problem that is growing all the time and is not going to go away.
Seems like one of the big issues here is the unlimited amount of debt that you can incur. So wouldn't it make sense for the federal government to stop making loans for law school or guaranteeing them? That would shut off the spigot big time.
Absolutely. It would make sense. Again, Brian Tamana has an interesting suggestion in this regard. He says law schools should be limited to being able to have their students borrow a total sum amount for each class from the federal government, since this would have a particularly dampening effect on the huge schools that are like bringing in more and more students to take advantage of the federal loan pipeline. That's an interesting suggestion. Another suggestion would be more straightforward. Something along the lines that I understand you to be suggesting, which is you can only borrow X amount from the federal government to go to law school. That I think would make way more sense than the current system that we have. People talk about access, and access is important, for sure, but it doesn't do people from middle class backgrounds, let alone working class or poor backgrounds, a favor to allow them to borrow money that they will not be able to pay back. That puts them in a worse situation. And I think it's just shameful that Frank, I believe, mentioned that some of these elite schools who have more money than they know what to do with are not willing to do anything to support their students to go out and work at jobs that are extremely socially important, that generate all kinds of public goods, but don't pay enough. I mean, I don't want to be too sanctimonious about this, but that's just shameful. We live in an incredibly rich country, and if the elite schools can't support their own people to do socially important work, who's going to do it?
May happen anyway. Is one possibility as more students take advantage of the loan adjustment repayment rate. It's projected that that the politicians who passed that just had no idea what the likely default rate was going to be, and once they see it and realize what kind of income is getting transferred to law students, and lawyers not being the world's most beloved profession, there's going to be a lot of impetus from Congress to rethink the current loan packages. And I agree with Paul, that wouldn't be a bad thing.
I just would push back in just two respects. The first is maybe the legal profession is already managing the unsustainable model, right? Last year, for the first time in like a decade, applications to law schools, not only the top tier but lower tiers, dropped precipitously for the first time. Arguably, that could be evidence of the fact that people are finally starting to sense that the ROI on going to law school isn't what it used to be, or isn't whatever they perceived it to be. So maybe by virtue of doing nothing, we might see more of a convergence towards an appropriate supply and demand. Just the second thing I'd be curious to get your take on is if you're proposing that Stanford just cut its tuition unilaterally, is there any instance you can think of where any elite school has been able to change the education model by virtue of its unilateral action? I'm just thinking of, like 5 years ago, Harvard for undergrad got rid of early decision because they thought it favored wealthier students. But because no one else followed suit 5 years later, they ended up sort of backtracking and going back to the status quo. Why would Stanford be any different in the model that you proposed?
That's a good question. Answering your first question first, unfortunately, I don't think that just taking a laissez-faire attitude is nearly enough. The problem is that because of this federal loan structure, law schools can just reach deeper and deeper into the applicant pool, and that will just actually exacerbate the situation, because the people who will end up going to law school will be in a worse position than the more rational, if you will, people who will be opting out. Now there is an end point at which you can't go lower, and especially because one potentially positive aspect of the ABA credit